Well, I guess the only other thing is, yeah, we could mute. All right, it looks like we are underway. So as you all trickle in, I'm watching participants jump in. We want to say thank you for joining us for this webinar. Global Immersion has been seen one of the ways that we train in the work of everyday peacemaking is by hosting these virtual classrooms to better understand conflicts that often are really complex or really far from us and move us close to them so that we can understand what it means to show up in the midst of conflict as people who are participating for God's holistic restoration in the midst of that. One of the ways we do it is to learn from people that are embedded in these conflicts who can help us have more color in how we see these issues that are often in the headlines for a couple of weeks and move on and say, wait a minute, it's not just about responding to headlines, it's about being people who show up for the long haul. And so in this conversation, we're asking the question, how do we support Ukrainians at the border without ignoring everyone else? Which is a question we'll offer some more nuance to here in a minute. But I think we all can collectively say our hearts have been breaking for Ukrainians now for a couple of months. As we've watched the Russian invasion, we're watching families displaced and losing loved ones, a reality that many sisters and brothers across the world have experienced displacement as a result of violence. We're seeing that in such a tangible way. And this is a reality that is not just remaining on the other side of the world. This is becoming very tangible as thousands arrive at the border of the United States seeking asylum and seeking humanitarian aid. So what does it mean for us to show up in this moment, knowing that this is not the first time that people have come to our border seeking asylum or refugees coming to our borders, nor are Ukrainians, even in this moment, the only ones seeking support. So what do we do and how do we show up? That's one of the ways we're going to think about this conversation. For context, who is Global Immersion? We're a peacemaking training organization. We form people of faith to be everyday peacemakers. We offer tools to engage conflict, to transform and to heal. My name is John Huckins. I'm co-founding director. The way that we train in everyday peacemaking, free and public, is through our monthly peace periodical. It's a long form content and resources offering you tools to engage the conflicts of our world constructively. Every single week, we offer what we call daily prayers 3 times, each Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday morning at 7 o'clock for you to shape your own soul as an everyday peacemaker. And then we offer podcasts and webinars like this. There's links dropping in the chat for you to subscribe to Monthly Peace and to participate in our daily prayers. We also work with leaders, specifically offering leadership cohorts for those that are trying to build their tools for engaging in the work of reconciliation in tangible ways and coaching to those along the way. Why do we do this? We believe ultimately that God's mission is restoration and that peacemaking is our vocation as God's people. And so all of our work is towards those ends. And we want to specifically thank at the beginning of this webinar, our Embers community, which is a community of funders who support this work and funded even this webinar. So thank you for that. And if you want to participate and join that, there's a link in the chat as well. So some nuts and bolts here. Throughout this webinar, we want to invite you to interact in the chat. Write in comments, begin with even right now, write in your name, where you're from, and why you're on this webinar, so we can begin to orient to each other. Throughout the conversation we have with Pedro and Jenny, we're asking you to drop in questions in the Q&A. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you see a Q&A function. And the last 15 minutes or so of this conversation will be directly interacting with your questions. We usually cannot get to all of them, but we'll get to what we can. So as you're listening and something pops for you, drop it in there and we'll do our best to interact with it. So with that being said, it's an honor to introduce you to 2 friends here who I've had the honor of working with in different capacities over the past decade or so. Jenny Yang is the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief. She provides oversight for all their advocacy initiatives and policy positions for the organization, and she leads the organization's public relations efforts. For me, more than that, she's a friend. She's a fellow parent of young kids, so she gets what it's like to make all this happen in the midst of so many moving pieces. And she's someone who's, as I was describing to Pedro before we jumped on here, someone who's been in it for the long haul, advocating and educating the church on how we care for immigrants and refugees. So we're thankful to have her. You'll hear from her in a second. Pedro Rios serves as the director of the American Friends Service Committee here at US-Mexico border programs and has been on staff with them for 15 years. He's a native San Diegan, which for those of you that understand San Diego is quite rare, actually. So many people that have moved here. He's worked on immigrants' rights and border issues for over 20 years. Those of us that know him here and have had the opportunity to work alongside him know him as one of the most credible eyes and ears on the border who we look to in moments like these and many others. He's also a friend and a fellow resident of this place. I live about 15 minutes from the border myself, and a colleague in supporting our annual binational La Posada Sin Fronteras celebration that we have binationally each Christmas season, which is a great gift. And you'll see the bios, the full bios for both of them in the chat section right now. So with that being said, could we just hear briefly from each of you? Jenny, why don't you go first? A bit of an introduction about yourself. Why and how does this topic we're talking about intersect with you and your work?
Yeah, well, I just think this is a very timely conversation because there's so much happening, not only at the border, but around the world that is really impacting our communities. And I think the fact that we are exploring today how we can respond as individuals is very important. And so I really approach issues of immigration from a very personal perspective. I am the daughter of immigrants, and I always have to mention that because I always try to relate to the experiences that people are going through who are very vulnerable around the world. And from my own father, he was orphaned during the Korean War and was able to years later get a visa to be able to come into the United States and work. And he was sponsored by Ford Motor Company. But growing up in a home where English was not our first language, at least for my parents, and where we ate different foods and looked different than the people that were around us, really shaped my deep understanding of what it means to be in an immigrant family and come from those roots and really try to preserve that tradition of welcome and hospitality and protection for people around the world who are facing similar circumstances that my dad did as someone who faced the consequences of war. So I think right now it's a really important time when we're seeing mass displacement around the world to really lean into the challenges and not ignore them because they're actually showing up right on our border. They're showing up right in our neighborhoods. And it's just something where for those of us who follow Christ, it's an incredible opportunity to really demonstrate the love of Christ in very tangible ways on both a personal level and a policy level as well. So that's how I approach a lot of these matters. And again, I think there's a lot to talk about regarding what's happening today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenny. Pedro, why don't you interact with that? How does this topic intersect with you and your work?
Yeah, thank you, John, and it's such a pleasure to be here. For me, I identify myself as a fronterizo, someone from the borderlands, and in that, it's my identification is based on straddling what it means to live along these borderlands, which in many cases define who belongs and who doesn't belong, and that definition comes by way of policies that are unfair or policies that are unjust, and so I see myself as someone who has the obligation and responsibility to address those in the best way that I can. And the American Friends Service Committee has been a vehicle for me to do just that and to bridge together not only my personal experiences, but also my professional preparation and background, where I could bring in my own family experience and migration stories and use that as a way to support others who are also in the process of migrating. So it certainly is a privilege for me to work with so many people who are in extremely vulnerable situations, but from whom I can learn a lot about what it means to survive and what it means to be human. So thank you again.
Thank you both. Thank you for your faithful work and witness in this area. Let me offer a bit of a framing for the conversation. Also, thank you for jumping in the comments with where you are and why you're in this conversation. If you haven't yet, please do so. And again, as you're listening now at this point, moving towards some of the content and questions, jump in the Q&A box with anything that comes to mind. For us organizationally, our starting point is understanding that trusting a belief that God's mission is actually to restore all that's broken. And it's not just about restoring individuals and individual souls, but it's a systemic restoration, that all things are being made new. And so we have to think about ways that systems like policy and borders impact the restoration of real people in real neighborhoods like each one of ours. And so for us as peacemakers, we have to pursue peace on a personal and a systemic level. that frames even how we think about the situation right now at the border. Tijuana is a border town. It's made up of immigrants, and I think it's roughly 70% of the current population is an immigrant in some way to that space. And it's a phenomenon here living in the borderlands that, San Diego, Tijuana, if you look at it from a satellite, it looks like one large metropolitan space, but it happens to have a border, but the communities are still very interdependent politically, socially, economically, much of what Pedro was just saying. And over the course of even the last decade, it's not uncommon for people to come to this border, to Tijuana, to seek asylum in the US. One has to turn them to go to a land border and meet a certain criteria to be granted asylum. 2015, it was lots of Syrians. In 2016, it's Haitians. 2018, many of you heard about the migrant caravan, or the Central Americans and Mexicans from the southern states coming to our border. You have people from Africa and Yemen and Afghanistan who are here at the border. And now in 2022, largely as a result of the Russian invasion, Ukrainians are here in Tijuana and seeking refuge in the United States. Now, our team and our close partners have been present to this reality for each of these waves over this last decade or so. But it's not just a wave, and that's something we want to frame early in this conversation. It's not just about what's happening right now. This is a daily reality of people displaced by violence seeking help, seeking refuge. When the headlines fade, the need for safety and security for those fleeing violence does not. So in all of this, we're in this moment, and the US, I would argue, and we would argue, was right to make a pathway for Ukrainians, and hopefully will continue to do so. The church is right to offer support in the way that they have. And so as we've been in conversation with humanitarians and faith leaders in Tijuana, we've also learned that there's more to the story. Can we support one group like the Ukrainians without excluding all the others who have been waiting for years, especially in light of COVID and the ways that with Title 42, which we'll get into later, has kept anyone from seeking asylum? A formational question I know I'm asking myself is, does it appear that my and our empathy is stronger for those who look like me and who share a common enemy? Might my empathy be wider when people look like me in the mirror and people are fleeing from an enemy like Russia, who the United States has seen as an enemy for so long? So today's conversation is going to hopefully give us perspective and tools for understanding the policy behind the movement across the border, or lack thereof at times, and give you a ground zero understanding of what's unfolding right now. And what has the US done to make a legal pathway for Ukrainians? How is that different or the same as other groups? What's a holistic way to engage for the long haul? So these are some of the questions that we'll be asking throughout that you can ask in the Q&A, and we hope to curate in a constructive way. So I'm going to go first to Jenny. Here we are as largely people of faith seeking to constructively engage this moment and moments beyond it. What's the legal pathway that the United States made for Ukrainians when this war started? Because it happened quickly, and we know that Ukrainians are able to enter the United States in an expedited way. So would you help us understand what actually unfolded there?
Sure. So actually today is a really timely day to talk about the various pathways that are offered to Ukrainians to come to the United States, because there was a huge announcement this morning from the White House that announced a new program in which individuals and entities in the United States can actually now sponsor Ukrainians that are overseas to enter the United States on parole. And so basically on Monday, April 25th, there will be information online where an individual or entity can file. And if you can prove that you can financially support a Ukrainian overseas, then that Ukrainian can get paroled into the United States and apply for work authorization. And so this really applies for anyone who knows any Ukrainian in any context. And so this is significant because this is really an innovative program that the administration has put forward that allows anyone with a connection to the United States to be able to get legal status to come here. Now, that is one pathway that was just established and announced today that will allow individuals to be eligible for parole. But what's also important to recognize is that there continues to be large numbers of Ukrainians that are coming to the border that are seeking asylum. And just in the past 2 months or so, the US has processed 10,000 Ukrainians at the border, and they are mostly being paroled in at ports of entry. Now, parole is a temporary immigration status. It does not confer a green card nor citizenship, and it does also not confer employment authorization or any kind of public benefits. So it really is a temporary legal status that individuals have that does not really lead to long-term protection, but it is a tool being used by the administration to really allow Ukrainians to be able to enter the United States on a temporary basis. Now, I think, as you mentioned, there's some glaring equity issues because Title 42 right now is being employed at the border, and Title 42 is a public health order in which, to prevent the spread of COVID, the US and Mexico border pretty much has been shut down for individuals to be able to enter and even claim asylum. And so ever since Title 42 has been used, there's been over a million individuals, about 1.2 people, who have been turned away at the border because of Title 42. Now, the administration announced that they're planning to end the program in about a month on May 23rd. And so that decision is being applauded by many immigration advocates and public health officials, because there's no reason why, as public health officials have said, that there's reason to believe that immigrants coming to the US are spreading COVID. This is an internal problem to our country. And so it's just an outdated law and order that really needs to be revised. And so I think for Ukrainians, there are these various pathways, but I think, as you mentioned, there has to be this larger conversation around other people who are vulnerable, who are not being able to access these pathways of protection into the United States, even though the vulnerability is the same, if not more glaring, for those who have been in very vulnerable situations overseas for a long time.
That's really helpful. So in practice, that looks like a Ukrainian being able to come to our border. Actually, I just flew into Tijuana a couple days ago, and there was a lot of Ukrainians right there in the airport. They're able to come to our land border to seek asylum, because that's how you seek asylum, is at a land border. And they are being able to move through the border while other Central Americans, Southern Mexico, folks from Yemen are waiting in shelters and not able to even apply because of Title 42.
That's correct. And I think that basically in early March, the administration sent a memo to Customs and Border Patrol saying that they should exempt Ukrainians from Title 42. And so this is a very special carve out for one specific nationality. And I think, it is important that we recognize the political kind of priorities that the White House and the president right now have regarding Ukraine and Russia. Sure. And given all the diplomacy we have with Poland and other countries that are hosting large numbers of Ukrainians, we have to do something policy-wise to accept a larger number of Ukrainians as well. But what this also evidences is the fact that when there's a political will, there's a way. And the fact that we have shuttered our border to other nationalities really undermines the US really upholding international law and allowing asylum to be a legal right for those who need to claim asylum in the United States. That's right. And so I think, if anything, this is a glaring, obvious example of what the US can do, but hasn't done for individuals that really need protection in the United States.
Yeah, one really practical way, I think, in a haunting way, we see that is, people from Yemen, who many would argue is one of the world's worst genocides, but those that are bombing them are from Saudi Arabia, who have been historically an ally of the United States. So, it's almost as if, again, the question I'm asking, if people look like me and we share a common enemy, there's political will. If they don't, there doesn't seem to be, or at least that's what it appears. And so to interact with that with you is helpful for us to try to think about this critically, and not to dismiss the need for support, humanitarian support for Ukrainians. We need that, and who else needs that as well? One last question before we go to Pedro, Jenny. MPP, which is some people know as Remain in Mexico policy, when Title 42 is taken off the books, which it seems like it will be by the end of next month, how do we see the potential influx in folks coming to the border? And I'm hearing word the MPP will be reinstated at that point. And so maybe you need to give a little bit more context on what that means.
Yeah, so there are two policies at play whenever we're talking about the border. So Title 42 is public health law that is really preventing individuals from claiming asylum in the United States, but that's also intermixed with MPP, which is Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a policy, both of which Title 42 MPP were instated by the Trump administration. And when Biden took office, he did rescind the policy, but then was summarily sued by the states of Texas and Missouri to reinstate the policy. And so the Supreme Court is actually hearing arguments about the administration's executive authority to be able to rescind this policy. And really based on the decision from the Supreme Court, that's when we'll know whether or not MPP is going to continue to be effective or not. But basically, MPP is a policy in which individuals that are trying to seek asylum in the United States have to wait for their court hearings in Mexico and not in the United States. And it's really been detrimental because many of the individuals that are trying to claim asylum in the United States do not have access to legal counsel, continue to be vulnerable to violence, and become more vulnerable while they may wait in Mexico. And so the fact that we have this policy in place, again, is a deterrent. I think it's being used by the administration as a deterrent, and really puts vulnerable people in even more vulnerable situations. And so both of these policies, we're hoping, one through the legal system, and then the other that really is an executive decision by the administration, which we're hoping will end in about a month, are both will determine the numbers that we're going to see at the border. But I do think, there's been a lot of concern from policymakers on both sides of the aisle that the ending of Title 42 of the public health law will mean a renewed wave of migrants to the border. And so I think, we're preparing for that. I think the administration is trying to determine how they're going to process individuals, but there's no doubt that the right to seek asylum is a right that is afforded to individuals who need protection. And, the United States has the capacity and the ability to process individuals, and it's going to take resources and creativity. Sure. But if we can do it for Ukrainians, then we can do it for other people as well.
Awesome. Okay, Pedro, I want to go to you. And you, like me, have seen and been part of the network binationally here in Tijuana, San Diego, of folks that rally in these moments to support those in need. We saw it especially in 2018, again right now. And Ukrainians right now do need support. So what's your analysis of what you're seeing in Tijuana, San Diego, in regards to supporting Ukrainians? What's working? What's encouraging you right now?
Yeah, thank you, John. And I think so. The support for Ukrainians allows us the opportunity to compare how the process should work for everyone, but that seldom does. And I know that Jenny has already pointed some of that disparate treatment. The United States has processed, as Jenny said, an estimated 10,000. I'm hearing up to 15,000 Ukrainians over the past 2 months, roughly about 1,000 people per day. What this means is that Ukrainians who arrive in Tijuana are being ushered to be quickly processed by U.S. authorities. And so that process is working quite well. There's a makeshift tent city that has been set up just a short distance from the Petys border crossing. And according to one Ukrainian individual that I spoke with, he was expecting to wait 30 hours before it would be his turn to present himself at the San Isidro port of entry. So 30 hours compared to what you referenced earlier, several years in some cases for people that are coming from Cameroon, from Haiti, from Central or South America, or even from Mexico itself. The Ped-West pedestrian border crossing, which has been closed for over a year, is now a dedicated processing center for the Ukrainians. On the US side, and I saw this today, for the first time, the Ped-West, you have people that have set up canopies. There is clothing, food, and other types of material aid for the Ukrainians that are entering the US. I've never seen this before, especially where a US facility, a US port of entry is being used as a staging ground for providing this type of humanitarian support. On the Mexican side, the Tijuana municipal government has opened up a shelter for the Ukrainians. The shelter is equipped with resources and supplies so that Ukrainians, as they wait their turn, can use them before they're ushered again to the port of entry. Now, and I do want to be clear that this is mostly how things should be done. And this isn't to say that all Ukrainians that are arriving in Tijuana and that are being processed by Customs and Border Protection are receiving red carpet treatment. That's not true. There have been cases of some families that have already been separated, although generally the experience that Ukrainians are having is of being treated humanely, of being processed quite expeditiously. And what I'm saying and what many advocates are saying is that this should not be an exception. Migrants from all parts of the world facing wars, violence by state and non-state actors, displaced by climate change, by organized crime, by natural disasters, should all share in the experience that the Ukrainians are having. One that prioritizes the humanitarian support that vulnerable people need when they're migrating from harm. And obviously, I think it allows us an opportunity to call to question the assertions that the U.S. government has made in the past that they don't have the resources, the space to respond to the many individuals that have arrived in the past seeking shelter, seeking asylum.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Even the visuals there, Pedro, of what's actually happening on the ground. And we would say, too, early on, a lot of churches were doing the support. Now I know Catholic Charities, Jewish Family Services have stepped in to support once Ukrainians are across into San Diego and helping them move through the process. So if you are looking to support, those organizations are great ways to do that. As you think about, and as you've described there, are you seeing that, you're talking about this as an exemplar, this is how we need to engage with vulnerable groups. Are you seeing those that have not received that treatment feel dissonance or confusion or discord? I'm picturing so many of the shelters I know that we've been connected to over this last decade who are faithfully finding ways to care for families in impossible situations without ever knowing if their number is going to come up to actually request asylum at the border. What are you seeing anything there?
I would say that not in all cases, but certainly the disparate treatment is quite evident. And so there is a little bit of discord, but it's not a generalized discord. There is an understanding that it's how the US government has chosen to process Ukrainians versus everyone else. And so the discord isn't necessarily towards the people from Ukraine, it's really against the government. And if we do a comparison, so for instance, when MPP was announced that it was going to begin processed again, there were a lot of people, initially mainly Haitians, but also Central Americans and some Mexicans, that arrived at the Ped West area in Tijuana known as Chaparral, and they formed an encampment. And there were at one point up to a couple thousand people, a good percentage of them who were children, that were waiting for information about how they too might be processed and might be allowed the opportunity to make an inquiry about their right to seek asylum. About a week short of the 1-year anniversary of the Chaparral encampment, Mexican authorities from the 3 levels, from municipal, state, and federal authorities, arrived and they dismantled the encampment. And they lied to many of the migrants there. They told them that there were shelters that were waiting for them. Now, in some cases, people went to the shelters and the shelter said, we don't have the space for you. Or they said, well, we didn't know that the Mexican government was going to send you here. And in some cases, people just don't feel comfortable going to the shelters because there are members of organized crime groups that also are at the shelters, seeing who arrives from their places of origin, to then target them for violence or all sorts of other types of different scenarios that they could face. So, I think that the contrast is certainly there. The disparate treatment is quite evident, certainly among advocates, as we have pointed it out, but also with the migrants themselves, who now you have, for instance, Mexican authorities that are stationed right at the port of entry where one crosses walking from Tijuana to San Diego. And if they see someone from Central America, from South America, someone that's not Ukrainian, they will call immigration authorities, Mexican immigration authorities, and that individual likely will be detained for some unknown amount of time. So the coordination is between the U.S. and Mexican authorities, is also signifying the different treatment that people are receiving. And it's unfortunate because in the past, when the U.S. government, not only did it have Title 42, but also the MPP, but it also initiated something that we would call the metering process, where they would say they didn't have enough personnel to process as many people that were arriving at the port. Sometimes it was 30 people, sometimes it was only one person, and that seemed like a victory. So comparing that to the up to 1,000 Ukrainians per day, just is stark. It's disappointing, but also shows the different treatment. And as as Jenny mentioned, it becomes a question of not whether the U.S. government has the resources to take in migrants requesting asylum, but it becomes a question of whether it has the political will to do so. And in this case, for migrants from Ukraine, it does have the political will. For everyone else, it does not.
Thank you. To that point, Jenny, how might we, you've been at the front of this struggle to communicate the need for a holistic immigration reform. And we are in an archaic system that has not been reformed for so long and is not reflective of our current reality, our current world, our current country, demographics. How might this lead to a potential opportunity towards a more holistic immigration reform on a national level that would benefit all those that are currently at the border, not just select groups?
Yeah, well, I think the response that the US has had towards Ukrainians demonstrates the creative capacity of the administration to be able to utilize asylum and refugee programs and parole as tools of protection. And again, I think if we are specifically using these tools for Ukrainians, then and providing unique programming to do that, then I think we need to do the same for other nationalities that are in very vulnerable situations who don't have that same type of access right now. So I do think this is a moment where there's been a lot of bipartisan support for the resettlement of Ukrainians, for the various immigration pathways that Ukrainians have had access to and now have access to. And I think it's hopefully going to widen the amount of support among congressional folks for our asylum and refugee programs. I do know that there continues to be strong concern outside of Ukrainians for other nationalities that will continue to come to the border. And so just this week, or just recently, I should say, there was a bill by Senator Langford from Oklahoma, a Republican, and Sinema from Arizona, who basically wants the Biden administration to keep Title 42 in place. I think there's a fear that lifting Title 42 will lead to a massive influx of migrants. And so again, I think there continues to be concerns around that, but I do think that this presents an opportunity for there to be broader support for asylum seekers, and really pointing out the glaring inequities within the system right now, where Ukrainians basically are preferenced right now for admission to the United States in various ways, really should be something that we hold the administration accountable to.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for those of you that are dropping questions in the Q&A. I know Jenny's interacted with some. We'll also interact with those verbally here in a bit too, just to make sure everyone is taking in the answers, because this is great questions, great responses. Pedro, let me go back to you. Are there ways that we can, in this moment, constructively, as everyday folks, engage on behalf of the Ukrainians that need our support and all of those fleeing violence at the border?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so in answering this question, I'd like to focus on the narrative aspect of it. So for instance, it's important to be careful that we don't fall into a scenario where we blame the Ukrainian migrants for the improved treatment that they're receiving when compared to everyone else. I think it's important to call attention to the authorities that have the responsibility to ensure that everyone is treated with dignity and with respect, especially those that are the most vulnerable. We have children that are unaccompanied or that are traveling in ways that are very dangerous for them. and other vulnerable population groups. And I think also we have to really debunk the false narrative that describes border communities of being under threat by migrants who are Black, Brown, and Indigenous. The use of militaristic language and water metaphors dehumanizes migrants and people generally because it points to them as being a problem rather than working towards solutions that uplifts their dignity. So for instance, if you review closely the Border Patrol Union's chatter on Twitter, they really are presenting the language of surge, which is again militaristic language. And it increases the acceptance and the tolerance for violent response to people who are migrating. And we've seen this, and I've seen this through previous administrations, the use of collective punishment. So when under the Trump administration, many times, and at least twice under the Biden administration, the closing down of ports and bringing out many agents to engage in these exercises where they shoot and fire flashbang grenades and smoke bombs to prepare for the possible incursion of a large group of migrants through the port of entry. All of this serves to present a narrative that migrants are violent, that are here to invade and are here as a surge, rather than needing to be responded with humanitarian aspects, which have yet to be fully developed even under the Biden administration. It's what we're seeing is very dangerous right now with many Democrats who are also possibly contemplating the keeping of Title 42, despite the fact that this was really pushed forward by Stephen Miller under the Trump administration, and that its origins of Title 42 back in the 1940s have a racist background that were developed with the purpose of the possibility of stopping migrants who were coming from countries that seemed to be depicted as undeserving, to be sending their nationals to the US to become part of this country. So those are the two aspects that I would point out in terms of how the narrative is getting framed around the topic of Title 42 especially.
Yeah, that's really, really good. And I think really helpful for us listening in. You know, we talk about everyday peacemaking is not just about responding, reacting and responding, but it's about who are we becoming and how are we interrogating systems and structures that we have inherited that place people like me in areas where we're scapegoating those that don't look like me, the people that are coming to our borders who we see as a threat simply because we don't understand their plight. We've historically marginalized and oppressed people with the color of their skin. This is a bigger formational invitation for us as we think about this one specific moment to say, what have I been part of and how am I intentionally dismantling that in my own heart and consciousness such that I can show up in constructive ways in moments like this. Jenny, let me go back to you on the Title 42. And Pedro brought up the racist background of this and the way it can be deployed as a weapon. And it was deployed as a way to say, in this moment, a bit neutered and like, oh, it's just helping keep COVID out of our borders. And maybe functionally that happened for a time. Why is it important that it ends? That's come up in the question multiple times. And the other question was, I think is important, you know, we just had the military pullout in Afghanistan and we've had folks seeking refuge here. How is their situation different than what Ukrainians? Have they been treated differently or similar? Just help us understand that as well.
Yeah, so the difference is that the Afghans that were coming into the United States at the end of August were evacuated by the US government. And so there were individuals who were boarding planes within really a 2-week window and being evacuated to come to the United States through what we are calling safe havens, or 8 military bases in the US that for the past 4 or 5 months, from August to about March or so, were being processed and then eventually gone to local communities where many of us live. And so when the Afghans were evacuated, they entered into the United States under humanitarian parole, but then Congress actually had to pass legislation that would allow many of these Afghans to be eligible for benefits, that would allow them to get the support of resettlement agencies like World Relief to support them in their housing and access to like registering for schools and transportation and things like that. Just how we serve other refugees who come in under refugee status, but these Afghans were not refugees in that status, but were paroled into the US. And so I think for Ukrainians now, the reason why actually Department of Homeland Security is creating this new parole program where individuals can sponsor individuals for parole is that they recognize that when the Ukrainians come in, that they're not going to have financial support from the government. And so that's why they're allowing individuals in the US who can financially support Ukrainians at any point to be able to file these applications and sponsor these individuals to come into the US. So there are questions right now of, well, should Congress pass legislation to allow Ukrainians to be eligible for public benefits so that when they are paroled in, they can access these benefits? And that continues to be really an advocacy point that I think we need to continue to raise. And so I think being able to raise that point is going to be important for Ukrainians as they come in. So for Title 42, I would say that, again, the administration has said that they're planning to end the program on May 23rd. And right now, they do have about a month to try to figure out and build systems and processes so that those who do have a valid claim for asylum can come into the US potentially and be able to be seen before an immigration judge and state their claim. Now, right now, I think, they're getting a lot of pushback from a lot of people about why about not lifting Title 42. But again, I think if you're going to exempt an entire nationality from a public health code, and the fact that there's many public health professionals, including Dr. Fauci, who have said that migrants are not spreading COVID, then there's really not a need for Title 42. And before Title 42 was in place, we had hundreds of thousands of migrants also approaching the border, and processes and systems in place back then to be able to process these individuals. And now with better technology, now with, I think, stronger community support and networks, we do have the capacity, I think, to be able to process these individuals. And it's not to say that the asylum system right now is significantly backlogged. There are hundreds of thousands of cases that have not been adjudicated yet. At the same time, I think that should not preclude individuals who really need protection from being able to avail themselves of such in the US.
Thank you. Pedro, let me ask you one more question before we begin to move towards some words of encouragement and next steps. As one who lives here on the border and has seen these waves of need come from around the world to this borderlands, what are you thinking about, and what's it going to look like to show up and support as potentially large numbers of people come to the border if Title 42 gets dropped, seeking an opportunity to find refuge in the United States? Is the borderlands going to have the capacity for that on a humanitarian level, or what should we be thinking about in advance?
Yeah, so a couple of things, just to clear a couple of points out. The idea that, and this has been touted in the media a lot, that there have been over 1 million, I'm trying to remember the exact term that that CBP uses. I forgot what it is, but that over 1 million contacts have been made with people that Border Patrol has come into contact, as well as the OFO, the Office of Field Operation Agents. These are the customs agents at the ports. We have not seen this number before. Is not necessarily true. So last time, I think the highest numbers were in February and March of the year 2000. Now, the numbers today include a 27% roughly of people that have been apprehended in the past. And so if we reduce that number by the 27%, and if we look at when Title 42 was put in place, the number of contacts and apprehensions actually skyrocketed. So it's quite possible that the number of people that are presenting themselves at the ports or that Border Patrol is apprehending will be reduced. Also, in terms of how MPP will be applied, it's my understanding through conversations with CBP agents at the port that individuals that Border Patrol apprehends, so these are individuals that are crossing in spaces between the ports, MPP will apply to them. If someone present themselves at the port, then they will not be subject to MPP. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not CBP actually follows what the approaches that they described to advocates in a meeting a few weeks ago. I think that the US government needs to work with civil society organizations. It needs to draw a plan that contemplates how organizations that are on the ground that already have the experience, and you mentioned some of them, John, like Jewish Family Service, the San Diego Rapid Response Network, other organizations, as well as shelters in Tijuana, for instance, that have the experience of working with governments to ensure that the processing takes place in an effective way, so that there aren't any loose ends. At this point, I would say that if I were to give the Biden administration a letter grade, it would be a D, because there really hasn't been much communication for preparation leading to the May 23rd deadline. And it's a little worrisome because that deadline is approaching, and you can't just set up a tent city, for instance, as has been an idea has been floated in some government circles, that in San Diego there will be some sort of tent city or welcoming city of sorts that is temporary and not thought of as longer lasting, considering that migration likely will increase with the impact that climate change will have in sending communities. And so I think also just broadening this question a little bit more and thinking of future migration patterns, we're likely to see more people leaving their hometowns because of climate change. And that's something that has yet to be fully analyzed, even within the advocacy circles in the United States. I've been in international meetings where that conversation is taking place in a much more advanced setting. We've yet to really begin having that discussion in the US, both on the part of civil society organizations as well as US government entities.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for those two continuing to interact in the comments in the Q&A space. Let me jump in with a couple things, because some of you are asking what does it mean to actually support right now in all the ways that we've communicated, and others as well. We'll put in again World Relief, the organization that Jenny works for, that does incredible work, both on policy, but also on humanitarian. And there's an office here in Southern California that our organization has worked with in recent years. Pedro's organization, American Friends Service Committee, excuse me, excellent work here at the border, and support them, please. In 2018, in our binational response to the migrant caravan, a collective of binational partners said, what does it look like to actually show up for all the churches in Tijuana who are actually converting to shelters? There was such a massive need that a lot of churches were opening up their spaces, and migrants were finding homes in these churches for months and even now years. What came of that was an organization called Borderlands that we got to be intimately involved in, and even was in Global Immersion for a few years, and now is its own organization and continues to do the work of offering humanitarian aid and care for any refugees and asylum seekers and migrants in Tijuana, that offers trauma care and offers fair wage employment. And we encourage you to consider supporting them too. I know I've been on the phone regularly with their team on ways that they're showing up in hyper tangible ways for this moment with Ukrainians, and also for the moments beyond it. And that's something we want to bring up, that Samuel Perez, who leads their work in Tijuana, would argue, yes, we need your charity. In these moments, we need your financial support to care for the humanitarian needs of migrants. But more than that, we need your solidarity. We don't just need you to come and act like the heroes who drop the goods here. We need your relationship so that we're arm in arm when the next crisis hits. And so we're not thinking of this just with our dollars, but with our relationships and with our hands. And that's the posture they take. And so we encourage you to support them in addition to the organizations that Jenny and Pedro lead within. And the link is there. So Jenny, we'll go back to you. You know, as we come towards the end of our time here, what's your word of encouragement or your word of challenge? And sometimes those can be the same for us to engage this moment as everyday peacemakers who are seeing the need to show up. We're asking, what do we do? But we're also asking, okay, what is the larger story we need to understand and participate in for the long haul?
Yeah, well, I think that right now, what we've seen through the crisis in Ukraine and even in Afghanistan was global attention to the fact that we need to build welcoming communities. And whether those welcoming communities are in Poland or in Romania or right here in the US-Mexico border, I think that's the reality in which we live. It's we live in a global community. And so, you know, initially when the Russian invasion of Ukraine was happening, a lot of people were wondering, you know, what can I do to help the people there? And there was a lot we could do. I think World Relief, we are supporting partner organizations on the ground in Romania, Poland, Slovakia, and other places to respond immediately, and also within Ukraine to deliver assistance to populations there. At the same time, what I would often respond is that I think the best response is to get engaged locally with people that are in a similar situation to Ukrainians, and need protection. And so I think a lot of us want to help Ukrainians specifically, and I think there's ways that we can support organizations like World Relief that are directly responding overseas and trying to help Ukrainians in the United States as well. But at the same time, I really hope that our welcome and our desire to help Ukrainians isn't just limited to Ukrainians. And if there are other opportunities to help other refugees or immigrants in our communities that are just as vulnerable, that we also can step up and volunteer and give to those communities as well. So again, I think this is a hopeful time for many of us, despite what we see on the news, that I think through our community welcome, we can really be in mutual relationships with a lot of immigrants that are coming into our communities. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to engage in these conversations. And I would really just encourage everyone, if you either cannot sponsor a Ukrainian refugee or someone to come in, then really get connected to your local agency. I know a lot of you are in Southern California. I know Pedro works there. I know World Relief has an office there. We're always looking for volunteers to help out. There's other organizations in the communities that you work in that work directly with refugees and immigrants, but do reach out to them and ask them when your training is and what are events that you can hold maybe within your church. And these are all different ways to really get plugged in tangibly in your local neighborhood.
Thank you. I just had breakfast this morning with a dear friend who lives in Phoenix and was talking about the gift of those families that have arrived from Afghanistan and how they've shaped his neighborhood and shaped the church. And it's built these relationships between the local mosque and the local church. And it's building a collaboration beyond nationality and language and religion to see our common humanity that's transforming them mutually. It's an example of this. We don't always have to look out there or send money out there, but just be more present right where we are and build what we call these uncommon friendships that are a reflection of the world we trust that God is making. And so that's a good word. Thank you for that. Pedro, what's your encouragement or your challenge to us as everyday peacemakers?
I think my challenge word would be obligation, and I would pose it as a question. What's our obligation to this moment? Where do we fit in? Where can we support? Where can we lend a hand? Where could we show up in a way that really, again, uplifts the dignity of those that are being challenged to not be treated with dignity? And that could take multiple avenues, right? It could be being an advocate, speaking to your elected officials about this. It could be meeting up with other friends of mutual interests that are working on the ground, supporting people that are arriving, that are destitute. Could be connecting with local churches and supporting in that way. And if you have the ability, it might mean donating to organizations that are doing this work also. So there are multiple ways that you might show up and show the obligation that you have as a fellow human being to other fellow human beings who are in need. And I think that that's something that tends to drive me and drives a lot of people I know, and they might describe it as in different ways. But that's the first word that came to mind after having this wonderful conversation with you, John, and with Jenny, and looking at the comments that are coming through the chat.
Thank you. And even Pedro, as you were mentioning before we started here, you spent your day hosting a border tour today. There's something about that proximity. When you close the gap between us and them and you get close, it changes the economy of how we see these quote unquote conflicts or issues. And it turns 3D and it stirs our compassion. And so that's another opportunity that you model in your work is let's get close and let's learn across and through and see the beauty of the borders that can actually link our relationships. So awesome. We are going to have a follow-up email come out to all of you with information for supporting Pedro and Jenny's work, the work of the Borderlands, which is the organization I just mentioned that's offering ongoing care in Tijuana for migrants. There's so many other organizations that will continue to care beyond this crisis. We want to celebrate and support and be in relationships of solidarity. For us, Global Immersion, we encourage you to subscribe to our monthly peace periodical, which again has authors and long form content that resources you as an everyday peacemaker on these issues in real time. The next one's going to be in your inbox next week. Actually, we send them on the last day of every month, and there's a link there in the comments. Until then, I want to thank you both again, Jenny and Pedro, for your work more than anything, your friendship, and for your wisdom in this call. We are grateful. And so all of you listening in, may we be a people who have the ability to read the headlines and then ask the questions below them and beyond them, and to get proximate with those who maybe are outside of our worldview or outside of our orthodoxy or outside of our culture, and to show up in relationships of care and of love and show up for the long haul. Any ways that we can resource you towards those ends, we are committed to. So thanks for jumping in, and we'll see you all on our next webinar.